I welcome all of you to today's workshop on Asia in 2016, searching for solutions to domestic socio-economic problems, big power rivalry, and climate change. The, of course, all these things are not mutually exclusive. Just like we see some difficulties that appear in countries like a man with funny color shirts in Thailand, some in red, some in yellow, marching against each other, has come about after a period of slow economic growth and stagnation. 2016 is expected to have slightly lower growth than 2015. In fact, in the last revision of global projections by the International Monetary Fund, they have lowered it across the board. So today we have two panels, one on Southeast Asia and the next one on Northeast Asia. So let me introduce to you the moderator for the first session, Professor Leong Heng, who is a new member of the Sunway University. We have managed to poach him from the Malaysian University of Science and Technology. Welcome.
Of JCI, Jeffrey Chia Institute for Southeast Asia, and host for this event. I'm the moderator. That's me over there, Leong Heng. And today we have a very distinguished panel of speakers. I will say something about the order of the speakers. We're going to start with Professor Dr. Chalongphob Sussangkarn. It will be followed by Professor Dr. Tat Wai, Professor Tan, who will be followed by Professor Dr. Ghauth Jasmon, and then finally we have Professor Dr. Pangestu. Each of the speakers will have 15 minutes, and okay, I just remember something that it would be great if you can turn off your phone to silent mode or disconnect yourself so that when the speakers talk and debate this issue, you won't get interrupted. So we'll leave about 45 minutes for question and answer. I will introduce the speaker along the way. That means each time I invite them to speak, I will introduce them rather than all at once. Let me say something about the topic. There are two sessions today, like what Professor Wu said. This first session is on Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia has 10 countries that make up ASEAN. So it's a customary way of looking at this part of the world from the ASEAN perspective. The second session is on Northeast Asia. So it's a kind of like ASEAN, then +3. But a lot of issues are interrelated. So some of the speakers may be talking about Northeast Asia while presenting their views on Southeast Asia. We have 3 topics. It's 3 in 1. We have socio-economic problems and issues. We have big power rivalry and climate change. It looks like it's quite fashionable to have 3 in 1 these days. Product mix, we have 3 in 1 shampoo, even 3 in 1 ice cream, I think. So it's 3 in 1. And just before I introduce the speaker, let me say a bit that socio-economic development has always been in our agenda. You know, the East Asian countries, Japan, followed by Taiwan, South Korea, Malaysia. There's always this pressing need to develop socially and economically. We had double-digit growth. But as of late, there's the issue of this rapid economic development having some impact on the environment, perhaps creating some ecological imbalance. Hence, you have climate change problem. And we would like to see also how the rich countries, the big economies can play a role in dealing with these issues. It's sad to see that the weather condition and climate have come into an antagonistic, somewhat antagonistic and adversarial relationship with the need for socio-economic development. We still need socio-economic development, but we have to find a solution to this imbalance. So we're really privileged to have the first speaker, Professor Dr. Chalongphob Sussangkarn. He's a very distinguished man. He's the president of the Thai Development, former president of the Thai Development Research Institute, with a lot of experience on socio-economic development. He's formerly the Minister of Finance, formerly, and you need money to deal with all these issues. And he has a degree from Cambridge University, bachelor degree, master's degree, and all the way to PhD in economics. So it's my great pleasure to invite Professor Chalongphob Sussangkarn to be the first speaker.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be participating in this forum. And I will talk mainly about Thailand, but I will also show a lot of data on other Southeast Asian, not Southeast, East Asian economies. So I'll talk about Thailand's socioeconomic trends, some positive and negative factors. Can you, next slide, please. So the first slide here just shows basically the growth performance in ASEAN countries. And I break it down into 2005 to 2010, 2010 to 2015, and then for the average for the whole period. And what you can see from this graph is that the newer member countries, what we call CLMV, that's Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, are growing faster than the other countries because they're starting at a very low base. So this is a good thing because basically as ASEAN integrates, you want the poorer countries to catch up, okay? So this is good. And then at the next level, you have Philippines and Indonesia, which are doing well. Again, they are basically the two next to the CLMV in terms of per capita income, and they're doing well, which means they're also catching up. And then next we have Malaysia and Thailand. Thailand has not been performing so well, okay? We are much slower growth than Malaysia because of all kinds of political problems and so on. And of course you have Singapore and Brunei, who are the two richest countries, but they're very small city states. So do we expect that that growth doesn't really matter because Brunei, although slow growth, but per capita income is already too rich. Okay, next one, please. Now, if you look at the growth in recent periods, you find that there's a kind of changing of the drivers of growth. And here I show for Thailand, 2005 to 2010, 2010 to 14, and then the performance last year. Private consumption has been very weak, only about 2% in real terms. These are in real terms. Public consumption also has been declining or slower in recent years. Private investment, again, in last year was negative. Public investment, you can see here the changing pattern. It's been very sluggish up until 2015, which was last year. And then suddenly you have a big increase, 30%. And that's because the government is now starting on a number of major infrastructure projects. And you can see this in the figures. Export of goods, which used to be the driver for many ASEAN countries, you can see that it's been getting slower and slower and became negative last year. Export of service, on the other hand, is the opposite. That is, it's been actually increasing faster in recent years. And then in terms of GDP, it's below 3%. I think last year was 2.8%. So there's a changing pattern here that goods export is no longer the main driver, which used to be, say, 10 years ago. Services export is really been very helpful because the other sectors in the economy, whether it's investment or consumption, have been very weak, except that government investment is now picking up, and we expect this trend to continue. Next, please. The broad economic picture last year is that you have weak consumption growth, weak private investment, but strong public investment, poor merchandise export performance, very strong tourism growth, 20.4% growth in tourist arrivals, reaching 29.9 million last year, in spite of the bomb around the third quarter. And low energy and commodity prices, which affect everybody, and this has led to negative inflation. Last year was minus 0.9%. But this is very important also. Better exchange rate management from the second part of last year. Thailand was somewhat slow when basically the US dollar strengthened as a result of the announcement of the asset purchase by the Europeans. Thailand basically stick to the dollar for too long, whereas other countries weakened their currency more rapidly. And so in the second half, the baht weakened, and this helped export in terms of baht, local currency terms, to actually manage to be better than in US dollar term. Next, please. And this shows the export growth by month in terms of baht and dollar. You can see in terms of dollar, still negative, but the top line there is in terms of baht. Next, please. And this shows the nominal effective exchange rate and real effective exchange rate. It's just basically to highlight the fact that in this age of very volatile movement in exchange rate, one thing which is very important in determining monetary policy should be the relative exchange rate vis-a-vis your trading partners or competitors. And they need to be more vigilant in making sure that the baht does not become too strong. Next, please. Now, if you look at the various growth drivers and see what are the most effective drivers of growth, here I show you the figures for growth GDP multipliers. Now, if you spend 100, how much GDP do you get? If you get 100, it means multiply is 1. If you get more than 100, it means that it's more than 1. And here you see that in terms of total export, it's less than 1. Because we have a lot of export, we use a lot of imports. So you don't get all the money to recycle in the economy. But in terms of different types of export, food and agriculture export multiplies 1.35. So it's very effective in driving GDP growth. And then non-food manufactured export, 0.83. And this is because it requires a lot of input as imports. So the money that's going to circulate in the economy is therefore less than food and agriculture. Tourism is also very good, multiply 1.22. Investment, very bad, only 0.6, because a lot of investment has been imported, equipment and so on. Government consumption is about 1.5, is also very good. Next, please. If you look at our export and tourism growth, here I show the growth, average growth for non-food manufacture, the yellow bar. Green is the food and agriculture export, and then purple is the tourism. You can see here that tourism since 2005 has been growing at close to 15% per year. Whereas in terms of non-food manufacture, as the world economy slows down, etc., with China slowing down, the growth has been falling and falling. In terms of export of food and agriculture, it declined substantially between 2010 to 2015. I'll talk about this a little bit more. Next, please. Here is if you look at the same thing, but in baht terms, local currency. In terms of promoting growth, obviously local currency is important, because if you get more from export in local currency, then it helps to promote more growth. And here, in terms of local currency, tourism is even better. Next, please. Now, tourism here is a major positive of Thailand. And here I show, compared to other countries, tourism receipts, this is data for 2013, okay, in billion US dollar for a number of countries. China, close to 60 billion, because it's a very big country. Indonesia is about 10 billion. Malaysia is about 20. Philippines is maybe 6. Singapore, close to 20 billion. But if you look at Thailand, 45 billion. Okay. Next, please. Next. And this is looking at tourism receipt in terms of percentage of GDP. although China got 60 billion, but in terms of percent of GDP is nothing because the economy of China is so big. So in terms of contribution to GDP, it's really not that much. Indonesia also not so much. Malaysia is about 7%. Philippines about 2%. Singapore about 7%. But Thailand here is about 12%. So we get a lot of money from export, from tourism, and this has really been the bright spot over the last 10 years or so. Next, please. The other bright spot is auto sector. And here it shows these sales and production of various major ASEAN countries between 2010 and 2015. If you look at the sales, the biggest market now is Indonesia. Last year, sales was 1 million, more than 1 million units. Okay, but in terms of production, Indonesia produced about the same. Although there's some import and export, but in total, the production and demand are about the same. Malaysia also similar. Demand and production about the same, although production is a little bit lower. And the Philippines is still relatively small. But in Thailand, if you look, the demand is 800,000 units last year, but production is 1.9. In fact, in 2012 and 2013, our demand or sales was much larger than this, because at that time, the government of the day introduced what they call the first car buyer scheme. If you're a first-time buyer, then you can get excise tax rebate. It could amount to $3,000 US. So in those 2 years, 2012, 2013, sales shot up. It probably reached 1.4 million units. But then once that is finished, then sales came all the way down. Because once you buy your first car, you're still using it, so you don't need to buy another one. So in the case of auto sector, Thailand is still the center. But here you have TPP, okay? Japanese manufacturers has been lobbying the Thai government to join the TPP because they want some cars that that are manufactured in Thailand to be able to enjoy tax privilege when they export to the US. And clearly, this is a factor. Malaysia is part of TPP. Vietnam is part of TPP. So you may benefit a little bit from that. But in my view, this is still uncertain because we look at the types of cars that are used in the US. It's different to the types of cars that are used in Southeast Asia. Even pickup trucks. Thailand produces the most one-ton pickup trucks in the world. And Toyota export to 140 countries around the world. But the US, they don't use one-ton pickup truck. They use two-ton pickup truck. So, you know, to the extent that TPP may really benefit other countries in ASEAN, like Malaysia and Vietnam, is still somewhat uncertain. Next, please. Food and agriculture. A sector where Thailand has comparative advantage. We export a lot of food, we produce a lot of agricultural products. So it clearly should be a positive sector for Thailand. But unfortunately, because of policy mismanagement over the last decade or so, this sector has suffered a lot. Because basically this is to do with subsidy scheme for agricultural products introduced by Thaksin group, like mortgage, rice mortgage scheme, where the government pays for the mortgage at 40–50% the world price. So what happens is that the rice market disappeared. The government was the main buyer. So export basically almost disappeared. So this is being reversed now. And hopefully that this will help this sector recover. Of course, in the longer run, one has to be wary of impacts of global warming, because this can really affect comparative advantages in agriculture and food, you know, throughout the whole world. So this is something that Thailand is obviously concerned about. The other factor which is likely to be a negative. It's good. Okay, thank you. As ASEAN integrates, there has been a realignment in terms of flows of FDI. And this graph shows net FDI flows as a percentage of GDP. Net meaning that inflow minus outflow, okay? And what we see here is very interesting about how the production locations are being shifted around. Indonesia has been benefiting a little bit, and they're getting now close to 1.5% of net FDI inflow. Okay, Malaysia and Thailand have been net outflow. Okay? They're going to other countries. Philippines also a little bit, but Philippines FDI is not so far not that large. The country really benefiting is Vietnam. That's where the FDI are going. So this is something that is obviously a negative for a country like Thailand. Well, apart from auto sector, in other manufacturing sector, a lot of the FDI are in fact going elsewhere. And that's because now with the ASEAN integration, flows of goods across border in ASEAN is now relatively lower cost. So you don't have to locate in Thailand to sell it to Thailand. You can locate in Vietnam and then send it to the market in Thailand. So this is something that a lot of countries like Thailand and Malaysia should be wary of. Next, please. 2016 economic outlook, just briefly say the trend of 2015 will probably continue. And then my own numbers that I use is that this year's GDP growth is likely to range between 2.7 to 3.7%, depending on export growth and so on. Next, please. Now, looking at the longer trend around the road, we have some negatives to be concerned with. I don't know what happened to the fonts here, very strange, but this is basically showing the ratio of the old people in the population. Old meaning 65 and over to the whole population. And Thailand is one of the most rapidly aging population in the world, in fact, because we had very rapid population decline in the 70s, or population growth declines. So this is using UN projections, okay? And you see that for Thailand, in 2010, the ratio of the old to the total population was around 8.9%. In 50 years from 2010, in 2060, this is expected to be 32.4%. And if you look at this table, you can see that it's going to be close to the Northeast Asian levels. Okay? So we're aging, catching up rapidly to them. But unfortunately, we're not as rich as most of them. We're not as rich as Japan or Korea. Even China is now, in terms of per capita GDP, is higher. And therefore, this is clearly something that we have to be concerned with. Next, please. This is again showing the implication of that on dependency ratio. Dependency ratio here means the old plus the young divided by the working age population. The old 65 and over, the young 0 to 14, the working age population 15 to 64. And again, if you look at this, in 2010, Thailand's dependency ratio is around 39%, which is already, close to Korea, a little bit higher than China. Over time, this is expected to grow to 81.6% by 2060, which is again close to the Northeast Asia level, except for Japan and Korea, which is going to be over close to 100%. Okay. Whereas the other ASEAN countries, you don't see this kind of trend because some of them are still growing. Population growth is still quite high, like in the Philippines. So they're not going to face this kind of challenging trend. Next, please. Now, of course, there are some counterbalance factors to this aging trend. First of all, you can bring in migrant workers. And Thailand has many migrant workers. And I'm sure in Malaysia also. We have something like up to possibly 3 million, both so-called documented and undocumented migrants. So if you lack workers, you can bring more. Okay, and this helps a lot. Also, the presence of own account and unpaid family worker. That is, some people operate their own little business, or they could be employers. These have implications for retirement, because as they get beyond 65, as their own account worker, they don't have to retire. And what we find is that last year, based on the labor force surveys, people 65 and over, about 26% of them are still working in the workforce. So this means that as your old age ratio increases, it doesn't mean that the dependency ratio is going to be like what I show in the last graph. Okay. However, over the longer term, one would expect that people who are own account and unpaid family makers, the share of them in the labor force will tend to decline a little bit. And over the last 10 years, it declined from 55% to 53%. So there's a declining trend. So this means that this offset by the own account and unpaid family worker will become less important over time. Okay, lastly, just a couple of things. Yes, next slide, please. Another major negative for Thailand is the low education attainment of the workforce. And this was because we had relatively low enrollment at the secondary level up until the end of the 80s. It's only in the early 90s where enrollment at the secondary level really shot up very rapidly. But in terms of the labor force, this has a long-term implication. So as of 2015, and this is data from labor force surveys, 64% of the workforce still have lower secondary education or less. And lower secondary education now is not good for modern manufacturing. And so this is a big issue in the case of Thailand because you cannot change it quickly. You have to wait until the older people retire, the younger ones with better education come in. And this takes a lot of time. Next, please. And last slide is that this obviously has implications for the high income disparity in the case of Thailand. So, and this is something, again, not easy to solve, but it's a challenge that we will have to deal with because it has a lot of socio-economic implications and so on. Thank you very much.
As I've said before, we will let all the speakers speak, and then before we open up for question and answer. The next speaker will be Professor Dr. Tat Wai. If you get an engineering degree from MIT, and then you move on to University of Wisconsin Madison for economics, master's degree in economics, and then finally go on to a PhD in economics at Harvard University, what do you think will be your career path? That's the career path of Professor Dr. Tat Wai. He spent a few years, short while in Bang Negara and then moved up north to Penang to run his own steel mill. He has been a man of steel for many years, and he also sits on the board of a couple of banks, so he knows finance, he knows banking, and he is an industry man. So we'd like to invite Dr. Tan to give his views on this topic.
Good afternoon, everyone. Special thanks to JCI and Professor Wu for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. I will not give you a lot of facts and figures. I will just share with you a little bit of my view of how things might be happening. As the title tells you, China is adjusting, but I put a question mark because I'm not sure how quick and how well they will adjust. And I will also share with you, as China adjusts or not adjust so fast, what might happen to ASEAN, okay? Oops. I think easy I use that. Okay. I would like to start with a very broad sweep of the history of industrial development, okay? In the 70 years after World War II, there have been roughly 3 waves of the rise in industrialization among countries, okay? Largely happening in East and Southeast Asia. Next. The first to rise was, of course, Japan, but that's a little bit misleading because Japan was industrialized enough to be able to lead and invade most of East and Southeast Asia. So after the war, it was really just reconstruction and re-establishing all the industries. Okay, so very quickly they took over most of the consumer and industries from the US. Okay, these days you hear a lot of complaint in the US about how the Chinese have taken manufacturing jobs away from the Americans, but in truth, it started many, many years ago with the Japanese. Okay. In the 1980s, the South Korean, the Taiwanese, to a lesser extent, I suppose Singapore as well, became relatively important in the manufacturing sector, right? I think the case of Korea and Taiwan is especially important and interesting. They have been able to build a lot with their own resources, both capital and human resource, whereas Singapore is very dependent on both external technology, money, and people. I think Malaysians, we know, there's so many of us end up working in Singapore, okay? Next one, please. In 1990s, well, actually late 80s, early 90s, there was a brief period where Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia had an opportunity to build a broader and deeper industrial base. Unfortunately, it lasted less than 10 years, okay? What happened? I think two things. Firstly, our own human resources was not good enough, okay? If you talk to people who are in the private sector, they will tell you during that time, it was already extremely difficult to get skilled workers, engineers, and so on and so forth, okay? So when you want to continue to grow, you need to be able to keep upgrading and expanding the number of skilled people. But I think we were not able to catch up fast enough. On the other hand, China. China, firstly, a very big country, big market, very attractive, very much underinvested, very little foreign investment, but very important, a large pool of highly skilled labor, okay? And engineers and so on and so forth. So this provides a very important basis to absorb technology and to move up the technology ladder very fast, okay? Let's go on, please. So immediately, for the next 20 years, you can see very clearly that foreign investment in the three countries of ASEAN, Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia, dropped, okay? The only ASEAN country that has been able to maintain the foreign investment has been Singapore, okay? But the interesting thing is, South Korea and Taiwan continue to deepen and broaden, okay? And they are able to do this with a lot of returnees who have been working, especially in the US. Okay. So let's quickly talk about where is China now, okay? You can see from the first graph that China's corporate profit margin has started to slide after 2010, okay? And you can see that the SOE, the state-owned enterprises, have gone through a period of very rapid expansion. And as they expand, the profits start to drop, both when you measure in terms of sales or in terms of assets, right? And if you look at the Chinese companies broken up between the state-owned enterprises and the private sector, obviously the SOE are making a lot less, okay? And by coincidence, they are heavily concentrated in the heavy industries. Please. Okay? And because the heavy industries are the worst hit, so you can see from this graph that metals, especially steel, unfortunately I come from the steel industry, and unfortunately very, very squeezed, okay? Now, it is very interesting to look at this. This data is actually not complete in a sense. Here it shows you that the steel industries is still making slightly above zero, huh? But if you look at the profit figure that was announced, by the Chinese Iron and Steel Association that covers roughly 105 of the biggest steel companies in China. In the second half year of 2015, only half year, they lost 10 billion US dollar, okay? Producing slightly less than 400 million ton. And this 10 billion of loss is after taking into account the profit they make from non-steel business, okay? So our estimate is that they probably lost something like 15 billion US in the second half year, all right? That is roughly 40 US dollar per ton. Translated in ringgit, about 160, 180 ringgit per ton. And most of these are actually cash loss, okay? When that happened, right, what happened to the balance sheet? Firstly, the rapid asset expansion was able because of free-flowing money. So a lot of bank borrowing, right? And when you start to lose money, you have to borrow more money on the one hand, and you are losing your capital on the other, okay? So we took the accounts of roughly the top 40, 50 steel companies and did a little projection. If they were to continue to lose money at the rate of the second half of last year, in 2 years' time, some of them would have gearing of 4 times. And I think for those of you who look at finance, that's clearly untenable, okay? So this is, you can see from the second graph, okay? Debt as a percentage of GDP has gone up very high. And if you add up the corporate debt, in China it has already exceeded 160 million. 160% of GDP. Okay, next one please. Okay, I have covered all this, okay? So let's go to the next one. So, China has created massive overcapacity, right? As I said, unfortunately, steel is one of the worst. But steel is by no means the only one. They have created surplus capacity in cement, in aluminum, copper, shipbuilding, solar panels, many, many things. Okay, next one. And when you talk about surplus capacity, you're not talking about 20%, 30%. You're talking about 60%, 100%. Okay? Now, there's something else that's very interesting in the rise of China. Okay? Precisely because of their engineering skill, they have been able to take Western technology, modify them, and because the market is very big, build standard units. Okay? So if you were to try to expand capacity by using Western or Japanese equipment, you can expand at a lower pace. But if you are able to make your own standard equipment for particular markets and build it for only 1/3 of the cost, obviously you can build many more. And that is also the roots of the massive overcapacity, right? But I think please keep this point in mind because later on when we talk about ASEAN, there is some implication, please. Okay? Now, I just want to share with you very quickly the extent of the surplus capacity. As I said, you know, steel is terrible. Chinese domestic demand is roughly 650 million ton, but they have built 1.4 billion ton of capacity. Okay, and they say that, you know, we are only exporting 10-15% of our output, but the world's deep sea freely traded steel is only about 100 million ton. 200 million ton before the Chinese came in. So if the Chinese were to export 150 million ton, there's a huge impact on that, okay? Now, the other extreme is cement, right? Cement is not easily exported, okay? But even then, if you look at cement, Chinese demand, okay, is only about 2.2 billion metric ton. They have built a capacity of 3.5 billion and still growing, okay? Now, I already mentioned about the loss for the Chinese steel mill, but behind steel, there's iron ore, there's coking coal, okay? And Chinese iron ore are of lower quality. Iron content usually less than 40%, whereas if you buy from Australia, Brazil, iron content is 62-65%. So inferior quality, higher cost of production, similarly in coking coal. Therefore, if you add up the losses of the iron ore mines, the coal mines, I think that figure becomes even more staggering. Okay? So you can only dump so much. As domestic industries gets hurt, people enact trade barrier. In the US, when wire rod import reached roughly 30%, boom, door closed. When hot rolled coil reached 10%, boom, door closed. Unfortunately for us in Malaysia, the import of these two products are already 65% and we are still not quite doing anything, okay? Anyway, that is a sidetrack. So what I'm trying to say is, in something like cement where you can't export, you have to deal with it. In something like steel, even though you can export for a few years, right? As the doors close, especially in major countries like the US and EU, right? I think that opportunity will shrink. Okay, next please. Therefore, like it or not, procrastinating or not, sooner or later the problem has to be solved. Okay, it has to be dealt with. The later you deal with a structural problem, the more painful it is, right? But are we seeing that the government has the stomach to really push through? I'm afraid that the answer is no. They have been talking about closing down, okay? But they're talking about in steel closing down 150 million ton over the next 5 years, okay? When the surplus is a few hundred million ton. And if you read the pronouncement on cement, on aluminum, on everything, it is at that same rate. Why? Because there are two reasons, okay? Number one, many of these companies are actually partially owned by local government, okay? And local government has to be concerned about employment, or rather unemployment, okay? They have to be concerned about collecting taxes, right? And obviously they will resist. And if you were to close down, because these are heavily funded by bank borrowing, there are implications for the bank. Okay? So I'm not very optimistic that restructuring will be fast. Okay? Now, so far I've talked about very, very pessimistic things. But on the other hand, we also know that the Chinese are quite robust in certain other things. I mean, everybody hear about Alibaba, Tencent, and things like that, okay? But the problem with this type of development is that they are at the same time, okay, creating value, but they are also destroying value of some of the traditional sector, okay? So net in the short run, the compensating effect will not be sufficient compared to the need of restructuring of all these surplus capacities, okay? So going forward, right, as Professor's data has shown, I think China will start the aging process, maybe not as fast as Japan now, but it is starting already. So labor will start to tighten up. Environment has become a big issue. Corporate debt has shot up, right? Okay, so the Chinese, to be fair, have taken cognizance of this at the central government level. They've been talking about dealing with capacity surplus for a long time. They've been talking about it for at least 6-7 years. But when they talk about shutting small capacity, what the companies did is to build bigger one to replace a smaller one. Okay? So as the government raised the definition of small from 300,000 ton to 600,000 ton, okay, the 300,000 ton is replaced by 1,000,000 ton. The 600,000 ton is replaced by 2,000,000 ton. So the problem actually did not get solved. Okay, please go. Cover already, okay? So, frankly, I don't think the Chinese government is going to be able to do very, very quickly, right? So in this context, we'll ask, what is going to happen to ASEAN, right? My caption is, will ASEAN get a second chance? The first chance was the late 80s and early 90s, where there were a lot of foreign investment and there were a lot of new industrial base built, right? I mean, Thailand's automotive industry really expanded in a big way during that time, okay? So, will we get a second chance? I think the Chinese industries has to restructure. When they restructure, what will happen? Initially, before they are willing to restructure, when they dump their products, it destroyed the financial strength of ASEAN companies. It also prevents us from further investing in areas that we know. So that's an obvious threat, right? But should they start to adjust, if they stopped dumping in the way they did, right, immediately things will be different. So I can again illustrate to you, after Chinese New Year, in the last 1 month, steel prices have gone up by approximately $60 a ton in 4 weeks. Okay? If this trend were to continue, because they need to increase by $60 in order for them to break even. Okay? And in the last few days, you already see the share prices of local steel companies moving, because with this increase in prices, everybody can make money again. All right? But what can we do? As again, Professor has already illustrated, tourism is very important for Thailand. Tourism is very important for Malaysia, right? But can we just depend on tourism? My contention is no. I think every country can grow in a sustained way if you have more than one leg. If you walk on one leg, I think it's potential trouble, okay? Now, the level of foreign investment in China is high. Domestic Chinese business is actually very competitive. Wages are no longer cheap. In fact, along the eastern seaboard, they're more expensive than Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. So many industries will start to lose interest in producing in China. They have to look for a new home. Please. Okay? However, many of the Chinese companies have done well. Okay? When they develop the industries, the difference between the way it was developed in the late 80s, early 90s in ASEAN is that not a single country developed the whole supply chain. Okay? Some parts were manufactured in Malaysia, some in Singapore, some in Thailand, and so on and so forth. But in many industries, China has developed the whole supply chain. Okay? So when they have the whole supply chain and they are in control themselves, they have cash, I think they are and they will have to look for alternative, right? And they are already looking at possibility of investing in ASEAN. Of course, elsewhere as well, right? So, in the past, in the 80s and 90s, the other reason for not being able to sustain was that each of the market are quite distinct. Whereas with ASEAN Economic Community, the markets start to become a little bit more interesting. Next, please. Okay? Now, let me talk about the other big power, Japan, right? Obviously, the Japanese are not completely comfortable investing in China, right? And the Japanese were very important in helping to build the industrial base in ASEAN in the 80s and 90s, right? I think obviously they are interested to come back, right? And with the aging population, I think they have to move out. Otherwise, they cannot maintain the leadership position that they have in some of their own industries. Okay? So, again, we have the potential to try to receive investment from Japan. Okay? Let's go a bit faster. Okay? So, what are the key conditions that are required to attract them? Infrastructure. Keep building. Okay? Skilled labor. We were very short. I think in terms of skilled labor, we are still very short. If anything at all, if you talk to people in business, they tell you that the quality and quantity of skilled people in Malaysia, at least, is actually becoming worse compared to the 90s, right? So if we truly want to attract foreign capital and technology, I think we have to do a very fundamental change in this. Okay? We also need to do a very fundamental change in attitude, because the Chinese, the Japanese are all very insistent on discipline. Okay? The Chinese are used to flexibility and paying by piece rate. Okay? No work rule like us. Don't work on Saturday and Sunday. You work on Saturday, you have to pay more. Okay? So are we ready to deal with all this? Right? The last point I want to make is that in the case of Korea and Taiwan, they are able to continue to grow, right? Deepen and broaden despite the rise of China. Why? Because of human resource and because the large number of returnees. Okay? In Malaysia, for example, we have a large number of Malaysians working all over the world. Okay? But are we able to attract them to come back? Right? I think I will end here because these are, to me, precisely the key condition that we have to do to try to attract, and that's when we have a second chance. Infrastructure is somewhat easier, but human resource, at the end of the day, is the key condition of seeing all this. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tan. You're ending your speech, I think, or your presentation on the topic of human resource is very timely because we are moving on to Professor Jasmon Ghauth, who is nobody is better than him on the development of human resources at the tertiary level. Professor Ghauth Jasmon has been a Vice Chancellor and President of a large private university and a large public university. He's very passionate about universities and education. So thank you, Professor, for coming up to present on this topic.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and a very good afternoon, Professor Wu Wing Tai, distinguished speakers and members of the floor. I see there are some academics here, so I'm becoming very nervous already. But anyway, I'm given 15 minutes to talk about whatever topic I want, and I've chosen to talk about education, and in particular education in Malaysia, because I think personally there is a serious issue to address now, and I will tell you why. But I'll just pick up from what was said by the last speaker, that actually human resource is key to going on from now, you know. Infrastructure is easy, he said, but it is the human resource development that is the key issue now. Now, very quickly, I have about 20 slides. First of all, there is the sad story about the oil crisis, and what I've read so far is that oil is going to be low, and some say it's going to be another 2 years, some say 3 years, some say 5 years. Whatever the years is bad news for Malaysia, because oil was a big revenue earner for this country. Next. And also the thing about the current economic downturn is that the number of unemployed graduates is on the increase. Okay, more and more graduates are not finding employment. And actually there's a very simple reason why this is the case, but we go on to the next slide first. Now, because of the reduction in government revenue, public universities have been cut, massive cuts. The university I came from before this, the operating cost has been cut by nearly 30%. So this is a very, very big cut. And not only the public university is suffering, even the private universities are suffering. You will hear that some private universities have been sold, up for sale and so on. So this is a direct consequence because of the oil crisis. But what is more interesting is that the Deputy Prime Minister has told all the public universities, do not ever increase fees. So your budget has been cut, but you're not allowed to increase the student fees. So what do? In the US, I know what they do. They increase the student fees. But in this country, we can't. So how do we solve this, if you think about it, I bet our professor from Harvard also cannot solve this problem. Or maybe we should employ the president of Harvard to do this job, Next slide. Okay, this is what has happened, the drop. And if the oil price continue to be low, I think we may see a further decrease, Next slide. The delicate problem about the university funding is just that in Malaysia, the percentage of government funding for university is up to 80%, And then you compare the other countries, except for Singapore, the rest are quite low. If you look at Indonesia, it's only 30%, which means the universities in the other countries are already able to find their own income, They are not so much reliant on government funding. But in Malaysia, this is very high. And that 80% is the one that is suffering, The cut is already too big. So this is the real issue for the public universities, actually. Next slide. And then we have this graduate unemployment survey, and this is done by JobStreet. And you find that actually the graduate employability problem, 51 are from public universities, actually. 51%, and 34% from the private university. So actually the private university graduates do better than the public university if you look at the percentage of graduates unemployed. So this is another added problem to the public university. You are producing graduates compared to the private sector is less employable. Next slide. And what are the issues related to employability? Well, the survey says poor attitude of character, poor command of English, and poor communication skill. Again, this is something that we have heard of for a long time. It's not a new issue. It's about poor command of English, poor communication skills. Okay, and it seems that these things that are being done at the universities don't seem to be so effective as what we thought it should be. Next slide. And this is the current statistics for Malaysian higher education. We have 20 public universities, we have 70 private universities. But one thing I must point out here is that we have many foreign universities setting up campuses in this country, and the latest to open was Jasmon from China. And I was told there will be another university from China setting up in Malaysia. So Malaysia seems to be a very favorite spot for foreign universities setting up campuses in this country. But I must say here also that not only the local private universities are suffering, even the foreign-based public universities in this country also is facing recruitment problems and so on. Several of the foreign-based private universities are seeing decreasing in student enrollment and so on. All right, next slide. Okay. Of course, the Ministry of Higher Education has many grand plans for higher education and so on. And one of the grandest plan is the PSPTN, Plan Strategic Pengajian Tinggi Negara, the National Higher Education Plan. I like to put up this chart because it's made very simple for us to understand, you see. And you look at this, it says 2 universities in the top 100 in world ranking by 2015. And here you see 3 in the top 100 by 2020, and 2 in the top 50 by that date. And 100,000 quality international students, 100,000 PhDs, Malaysian Nobel laureate, and so on. This is from the Plan Strategic Pengajian Tinggi Negara. Did we achieve any of this? you all answer it for me. You know? But this is the problem. We have a strategic plan, we have spent money, but we are not achieving it. Why is this, you know? So this is the real issue that the country has to address, you know. Why are we not achieving all these targets that we are saying? I mean, you talk about the 2 universities in the top 100, you know, by this 2015. We are not 2016. None of the Malaysian university is in the top 100 as of it today, right? Do you know any university? None. And I don't know how we are going to achieve the rest. And yet, this is a document that the government produced, I mean the Ministry of Higher Education, and we are not able to achieve it. So this is the issue, you know, and I don't know when we will get the first Malaysian Nobel laureate. Okay, these are things set by the government, and something somewhere needs to be done to address this issue. Next slide. Talking about getting into the top 100 and so on. Now this, I think, is a fantastic graph to explain why originally, for example, University of Malaya and the National Institute of Singapore were together, and yet over time, the National Institute of Singapore has gone into the top 50, and yet we are not even in the top 100, you know, simple. You look at this graph, and this graph shows the journal publication in the SCI journals. And you see over the years from 1981 to 96 and going forward, you see generally there's a upward trend. This is the graph for the University of Malaya. Very flat, but of course we have to go forward. It has gone up actually. And here is the National Nanyang University, National, you know, this National Technical Nanyang Technical University. At this point, it has overtaken UM, and it has gone up, and it is also in the top 50 in the world now. But UC of Malaya, the best in the country, has remained stable, you know. So what does this mean? That means the policy in Singapore and so on, they are very clear. They want their university to be of high quality, and they want their universities to compete, and they want their universities to participate in the ranking. I still remember in the 100th anniversary of Tsinghua University, China, and you know Tsinghua and Beijing are the top one in China, and I still remember that Sunday morning in that great hall where President Hu Jintao actually said it openly, and he said that he wants Tsinghua University to be the #1 university in the world soon, he said, you know. So you have a president of a country who's emphasizing that their university must be the top in the world. But I don't think we can say that for any of our universities, right? So again, we want to be excellent, we want to be in the top, but we are not telling our people to do so. It is in the document, no doubt, right? I mean, I didn't create this graph, I didn't come up with the policy, but these are very good policies, I think, that the ministry has created, but somehow we are not pushing for us to achieve those targets. Next slide. And again, of course, this is talking about R&D budgets relative to other countries and so on. We are relatively small, actually. Okay, how we wish that this is bigger lah. But it is okay. I don't have time to elaborate some of these things. I bet I'm already halfway, isn't it? Next slide. And we have the Malaysian Education Blueprint for Higher Education. This is a fantastic document, a very good, great document created by the ministry. Inside it is well charted what we are supposed to do, what we want to achieve, and how to achieve it. So I think in terms of ideas and so on, there's no shortage of it. It is a matter of achieving it now, you know. You can look up at this in the internet, and everything is laid out. I'm impressed. So if anybody wants me to give a talk on how to build world-class university, I'll copy everything from here. There's no problem with that. You know, I don't have to think hard about it. Next slide. Problem with the public university, well, highly dependent on government funding. Okay, so this implies that the public university now must really think of business and create revenue sources. And why I'm saying this, because I was impressed when I went to Bangkok. Chalongphob and Mahidol, they are only getting 30% funding for their OPEX from government. 70% is their own. I think Chalongphob has so many shop lots, you know, and shopping complex. That's very good, you know. And I did contribute to Chalongphob income. I did some shopping, you know. And then Mahidol, they have 5 private hospitals, and I think lately they have built another 2, I think. And that, 7 private hospitals is contributing to 70% of their income also. But in Malaysia, income from all these businesses is very small usually. You know, so the message that I have for Malaysia is that we need the management, you see, we need the vice chancellors to be more business-minded. Gone are the days that you find the best professor to do the job. We need professors who always think of money. And not only that, we need him to be supported by board of directors, which has got business ideas and which can drive the management to go into business. I know it's going to be tough, it's going to be challenging, but we have no other choice because we can't increase the fees, right? And next year we may be cut some more. So really there is no solution to this, but you have to go and do business, whatever it is. Isn't it, you know? Otherwise we will have keep on begging and begging and begging, and unless the oil price comes up, I think we will remain beggars, you know. And I say this because the president of University of Toronto, when he visited me, he said, actually we are all professional beggars, by the way, you know. And I agree with him, you know. And then graduate employability, well, again, sometimes I find that the ministry is not forceful enough to really push this issue that we must really get our graduates to speak English better, to communicate better, and sell themselves well. And not only that, the entrepreneurial skills also is not there. Actually, we actually examine the graduates. Who are they that make up this unemployability? You find that actually there are much more of the Bumiputra sector who are unemployed compared to the non-Bumis, you know. This is generally the case because I find that from my experience, many years interviewing candidates and so on. Normally the Bumiputra are less able to present themselves, communicate, whereas the non-Bumis are better able to express themselves and so on. And I think the university authorities have to really address this issue of why, you know, a certain sector of the population is facing this problem compared to the others, you know. Of course, I cannot go into detail in this lecture because that is an even deeper problem. And I'm not God, certainly. And then again, I've already mentioned that the appointment of the university boards and so on must now be much more inclined to be able to look for money, not by asking the alumni to donate. Somehow our graduates are very stingy. They're not like the Americans, you know. The Americans are very kind. I think the Singaporean and the Hong Kong graduates are much more kinder, but not the Malaysian ones. When I was Vice Chancellor, I tried to raise money. I think I spent more money on the stamps than, you know. And also in the university, when I was the VC, everybody wants to be the Vice Chancellor, by the way. If only they ask me now, actually I don't want to be a Vice Chancellor. It's a very tough job. Because at the end of the day, people think you are wrong all the time, you know. You cannot be right. But any professor in a public university wants to be a Vice Chancellor. Okay, especially if they have some cable with people in the ministry and so on. And then again, the issue about autonomy and global ranking and so on, these are issues which supposedly that we are supposed to have, but actually in reality, it's not so easy to implement, because if you try to implement any of these, then you become a very lonely person, Prof. So actually 5 years as a VC is good enough, I think. Next slide. Problem with private universities is slightly different. In the private university, nobody wants to become the president of the university. Why? Because I am in the board of several private universities, and by God, when I see the president of private university being fired and being torn down, why don't you achieve this target? And the only thing the president of the private university can do is to apologize, sorry, I'll try better. You at least sit beside there and you cry for them. You may be paid high, but it's not worth it, because you are being look like you are a fool, you know. So the good thing is that nobody wants to be president. Okay, you want me to stop already? Okay. Now, I must say about the for-profit status, Sunway University has a very good model, because somehow they have a group which one subsidizes the other. But many private universities, they are on their own. Their main income is student fees, and this is very dangerous. And under the current circumstances, when the fees has to be increased and student enrollment has gone down, income is much less, and a lot of them will have problems to survive, you know. So if you ever want to create a private university, do not ever just depend on the undergraduate fees. It's not going to work. In the long run, you will sell it at the end of the day, you know. So please, whereas in the US, people do give money to university because it is all being held by foundation. It's not for profit. But for private universities, which is owned by individuals and so on, if anybody donates to the university, it means going to their pocket, right? And you're not very keen to give anybody's pocket, right? Again, of course, the other issue about private university is qualification of academic staff, because many private universities, they are short of people, qualified people in terms of staff having a PhD. Okay, and these are among the things that you must have, and you have sufficient budget to train your people to have a PhD. Because you cannot be talking about world class unless you have sufficient staff who has PhDs and professors and so on, you know. So these are among challenges, and this costs money. To get people to go and do their PhD costs a lot of money. And again, under the current strain, whereby there's a fall in student enrollment, people tend to lower the cutoff point. It's another big problem. In other words, you don't get quality students into the system. Of course, the issue of research, there's negligible research in research output. And of course, a lot of the students that goes into the private university are dependent on the government study loan. This is also an issue. Okay, next slide. Now, this is one area that under the blueprint, they want to increase the number of people going to this area. But of course, the salary issue is always the problem. I know you want me to stop, but I'll go through the slide very quickly in 1 minute. Next slide. Okay. Challenges in realizing the Malaysian education blueprint. I think we need the ministry to be much more forceful in realizing those aspirations, because you have a very beautiful document. You have all the solutions to it, but you must be much more forceful to achieve them. I think, you know, no matter at what cost. Okay, and leaders must think more of actually getting the aspiration done more than their own political survival and so on, okay? Of course, the issue of leakages and so on, this is quite known in this country, because we have some ministries recently in the report, you know, where mid-range official could have bought so many handbags and things like that. Again, the racial issue is another issue in the universities, and again, the issue of meritocracy. Next slide. The school system. I know a bit about this because my own wife is a teacher and a principal. I'm glad that she wants to give up the job now, but But the teams and the PISA scores, which you all know, has been dropping. We are now behind Thailand and Vietnam. A bit sad about that. And the government must push up because there is a direct correlation between achievement in teams and PISA and in terms of the prosperity of the nation. Okay, among the greatest issue is the quality of teachers in the school, which I think again is very sensitive, but one that the ministry has to address. It's quite easy to become teachers in this country, but I know in countries like Korea and Finland, for example, is very, very difficult. All right, but it has been quite easy in this country. And again, I think the school should be given more autonomy. The principal of the school should be given the power to hire and fire. In this country, once you become a permanent teacher, you cannot fire them. In fact, the teacher can fire you. Okay? But I think these are common issues that you have seen in this country, that there are problems with the school system. One interesting is the projects at the national level that has been carried out for the school, which has not achieved its full targets. Okay, the One Bistari Net project is one example. Next slide. Even the former education minister was surprised of our performance in PISA and teams that have gone down. You know, even the minister was surprised, and of course, the ministry has to do something about it. Next slide. Okay, the ministry has come out with Malaysia Education Blueprint, a very beautiful document. I'm very impressed again, so I'm confident to talk about the school problem because of this document. So invite me, please. Okay. Next slide. And these are the 11 shifts that will be done under the Malaysian Education Blueprint until 2025 to achieve this improvement in the standards in the school. It is, I think, great. Nobody can dispute this. Okay, because this is about increasing the capacity, building the quality issues and so on. Again, a beautiful document, but how is the ministry going to achieve this? And for me, it's very simple. You have to push for it no matter what the challenges are. Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ghauth Jasmon. It's always delightful to listen to you and your diagnosis of the education system in Malaysia. We have covered 3 speakers. We've touched on all the socio-economic issues affecting ASEAN using their examples. And as a message from Professor Jasmon is that you don't want to get in a situation where the quality and things are spiraling downwards. Dr. Tan also shows that there's a Northeast Asia and Southeast Asian situations are interlinked. I think I'm going to invite the last speaker is for this session is Professor Mari Pangestu. Professor Mari was the Minister of Trade for Indonesia. She's a very distinguished academician who writes a lot on trade, economic integration issues. In fact, she is one of the architects of the mechanisms and institutions for economic integration in ASEAN, and we are hearing from the person who did it herself and who have helped ASEAN in many ways, and also on a lot of regional institutions and mechanisms. She has been deeply involved in those deliberations. So I welcome Professor Dr. Mari Pangestu. Hopefully you can do it within 15 to 20 minutes.
Thank you very much for your introduction. I'm not sure it's good or bad to be the last speaker, but I try my best to keep you awake. I thought, because our instruction was a little bit unclear, right? We were asked to say whatever we want to say, but it is about Southeast Asia. And what I want to try to explain and share with you today is what should we be doing as Southeast Asia in each economies in facing what is often termed as the new normal. So this changing world situation. And this is kind of a summary of the so-called new normal. A number of the previous speakers, and including Wing, touched on it. So basically you have slow global growth after the global financial crisis, which seems to have stayed. It's not a usual downturn in the business cycle. There's a structural problem, and I'm going to focus a lot on the trade side. And what we need to note on the trade side is that trade is growing at a much slower rate than ever before compared to pre-global crisis. You have falling commodity prices as well as demand, and that is affecting economies like Malaysia, I think somebody mentioned it earlier, and also Indonesia, who are dependent on commodities. We have to diversify our economies. Everybody talked about the slowdown in China, and there is changing technology, changing nature of the global value chain. How things are produced are very different now compared to 5-10 years ago, and that affects all that we are talking about in terms of growth, manufacturing, trade, and so on. Next. Okay, this is the impact of China on all of the countries. The red part is how much China contributes to our exports, and the ASEAN countries are on that side. And you can see how Indonesia, Argentina, the commodity exporters are really hard hit with the China slowdown. Next. And this is really for us as trade people and countries who are open like Malaysia, Singapore, who rely a lot on trade. This is scary because prior to the global financial crisis, 1% in income growth will give you 2%, 2.18% world trade growth. Now, your 1% of economic growth, which is already at a lower level, is only giving you 1.3% of trade growth. So this is a structural problem. And why has this happened? Next. And another qualification about that slowdown in growth of trade is that it's happening more in goods than in services. Okay, so if a number of you mentioned services, tourism, education, health, and so on, these are actually the new area and sources of growth that we should also be looking at. And it is the machinery and transport equipment is slowing down because of the changing nature of the global value chain. So the production networks that we were used to of the past, where different components and parts are being manufactured somewhere and assembled somewhere, is no longer the situation of today. That's why you have a decline in the growth. Next. And this is the possible explanations for why this structural change in the relationship between income and growth and the very sharp fall in trade growth. The global supply chain expansion of the 90s has just slowed down because of China. China was the hub. What happened is that China increasingly matured its global value chain. More and more components were being produced in China. So the share of trade going into China fell, even though it's Japanese companies, Korean companies, American companies producing in China. Yeah, but it reduced the trade. And the cause of the trade slowdown, according to all the analysis, is not so much because of increased protectionism, but because the easy part of reforms have been done. So the opening up of trade with China, accession to WTO, and so on, have come down. Tariffs have come down from 30% to less than 50%, 15% in developing countries, and from 10 to 5% in developed countries. The easy part of reforms are done. Okay, I'll come to the hard part of reforms, as that's actually where we have to go next. And this is the changing nature of the global value chain. It's not about I'm producing different parts and then I graduate as I become smarter in producing different parts. And then finally I get to produce more and more parts in my country like China. This is an example of an airplane that is being produced in US, Canada, Australia, Japan, Korea, and Europe, different parts of it. Actually, for a different part of Boeing, Indonesia does produce the wingtip. And also we do some of the maintenance and repair. So it's not just the goods, it's also the services. And of course the design is probably being done in France, in the US, in MIT, everywhere. Next. It's not just about goods, but it's about services. You need to have efficient services to be able to be competitive today. And it's about the tasks. You're focusing on, am I going to be the best hub for design and development? Am I going to have good distribution services? This is for an iPhone. Or am I going to be the best designer of Apple apps that goes inside the handphone. I don't have to be like China where all the iPhones and the iPads are being produced. But Indonesia, for instance, have a lot of young people who are designing apps that goes inside the Apple phone. Next. This is a non-conventional example. It's, again, showing you that global value chain is around tasks now, not about which part of the product you're producing. This is for Garfield, the production of Garfield. This is an actual example. Next time you watch Garfield, 50% of that is being produced in Indonesia, in an island called Batam. And it's where the blues color is where Indonesia is already part of the value chain of animation. Eventually, you want to be here. The high value is in the pre-production, the creation of the Garfield. And that's mainly still in Hollywood. Increasingly, of course, Japan and Korea. So Korea was where Indonesia is now like 10 years ago. Now Korea is already entering into here. And Japan, of course, differently. So you graduate in the value of the tasks in the value chain. Next. And therefore, it's a different world. The trade has slowed down. We need to go into services. We know that. And the way we look at trade is different. It has to be open in trade, investment, and services, and people. I think the movement of people is very important. Talent. You want the best talent to be in your country, to be competitive. And you want to have good education system so that you can have the human resources. You shouldn't be, because in a lot of our countries, including Indonesia, we are talking about, we have to downstream, downstream processing of all our raw materials, or, we want to produce everything in our country. We want to localize everything. That doesn't work anymore in today's world of more fragmented global value chain. There's an anti-import view in many countries, including Indonesia. But hey, if you want to export, you have to import, whether it's components or whether it's services or whether it's people. And what matters is the competitiveness is efficient, competitive services sector. So, we talk a lot about goods and reducing tariffs, but really the issue today is about the services sector and all the other new issues, which we will come to in a minute. So that's kind of the setting. This is the new normal. What should we do as each ASEAN country and as ASEAN? Next. The opportunity is there to grow. We need to diversify. We need to find new sources of growth. The level of openness is quite high. I still believe, I hope all of you still also believe, that trade is still needed for growth. Yeah. And the cause of the trade slowdown is not because of increased protectionism, but because of the slowdown of the easy part of reforms. We are now entering into the hard part of reforms. It's the non-tariff barriers, it's services, it's behind the border, domestic regulations, and so on. And these are the hard parts, politically much harder. So how do we shape reforms henceforth? Because if we don't reform, we cannot be diversifying, we cannot be competitive, we cannot be part of the global value chain, and so on. Next. This is my list of the area of reforms that all of us, all countries have to address. These are the structural reforms we have to be addressing. In goods, it's not just about the tariffs anymore. There are still some peak tariffs, but tariffs are already low. It's really the non-tariff measures, it's the rule of origin. Standards is really the thing. And then you enter into environment standards, good standards, technical standards, facilitation and customs, services. You need to have deeper, bolder reforms in allowing foreign providers of services in your country, and movement of professionals and talent. This is actually a very sensitive area. The Malaysian presentation was interesting for me. You are very open, but yet I was going to always use Malaysia as an example in Indonesia when I'm trying to push the opening up of the education sector. So I hope you can still say that there were still benefits from opening up. And a lot of domestic regulations which need to be addressed. Investment, IPR, and these are the new issues. Competition policy, government procurement, e-commerce. All countries, including the US, are still struggling with how to deal with e-commerce. Trade-related issues, labor and environment, climate change, and so on. And in TPP, there's even more new areas, state-owned enterprises and so-called regulatory coherence. Next. So the question is, how do we shape reforms? If we look at the past, international commitments and competitive liberalization was what shaped reforms in Southeast Asia in the last 20, 30 years. It was APEC and NAFTA which pushed the conclusion of the Uruguay round. In ASEAN, in Asia, Southeast Asia, we competed with each other in competitive liberalization, going for export-oriented liberalization. In the 90s, till the East Asian financial crisis, a number of us, of course, had to fulfill our WTO commitments. We had AFTA, remember AFTA, ASEAN Free Trade Area, and competitive unilateral liberalization. I think APEC made a difference at the time in the 90s. Next. And post East Asian financial crisis in 1997, China's accession to the WTO made a very, very big difference. And in ASEAN itself, we also deepened our integration with AEC, and then we had the ASEAN +1 FTAs with all those 6 countries, which basically means ASEAN, intra-ASEAN trade, 0 tariff. ASEAN with all these 6 countries, 0 tariff, more or less. And now, with the harder parts of reform, beyond tariffs, where will the impetus come from? That's really what I'm trying to share with you today. And at a point of time where nationalism, protectionism, democracies are, of course, what we want to have, but democracies also make it much harder to do reforms. We always say in the good old days, when in under old order period in Suharto, as long as he says, okay, whether you like it or not, do it. We can't do that anymore now. We have to go to parliament, we have to get support, we have to pass legislation through parliament. So, and it's not just in Southeast Asia, obviously in the US, if you listen to Donald Trump, and so on, it's in Europe, the kind of nationalistic rhetoric is very, very strong. And the issue of inequality is really what is affecting a lot of this anti-globalization. I wouldn't say it's anti-trade, it's more anti-globalization. So how do you do reforms in today's much more challenging world and much more complex political situation? How do you balance the national push for reforms with the external commitments? I still believe external commitments can play a role. If you can have the political commitment, but again, election cycles are short. So normally, in the honeymoon period, they may push for reforms, but when it comes closer to election cycle, they will slow down on reforms. So this is my list of how external commitments, we hope, can shape reforms in Southeast Asia. I'm not so hopeful about multilateral, the Doha and WTO kind of not going anywhere, but we still need WTO for dispute settlement. And mega regionals seems to be the flavor of the month or of the year now. It's the ASEAN Economic Community, it's the ASEAN +1 FTAs, which is going to be consolidated under RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. I don't know whether Japan, Korea, China will ever happen, but apparently they're talking to each other. And TPP, obviously, the big news of the day of last year was, the end of last year was TPP. And we have FTAAP, which is an APEC China kind of, all the APEC countries as one. And then as a we have the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank as China's answer to integrating through funding of infrastructure. And we have mega bilaterals as well. Next. This is what it looks like. Very complicated. If you're a business person and you have to face this and you have to understand this, you have to understand all the rules and the standards, it's going to cost you a lot. And it will affect and impede trade. So next, what is important is how do we consolidate? How do we make sense out of all this? And dealing with areas which there are no international agreement yet. You know, so, like tariffs and non-tariff barriers and so on, there is already international agreements. But how about the ones that don't have international agreements yet? If we don't, if TPP sets the standard for this, are we going to just accept it as developing countries? Can we actually fulfill some of these very, very high standards? Next. Unfortunately, there's TPP up here, and then there's ASEAN and RCEP, which is still at a very low level of economic integration. Basically goods, not even yet addressing non-tariff measures, some services, some investment, but not very deep and not very bold. And then we have TPP with 30 chapters, and very broad and very deep, and in addressing issues that we don't even know how to deal with yet. This is what TPP looks like. The asterisks are the areas where we don't have any international agreement, and it is really the unknown, which can affect trade, investment, and the way we are going to engage in the future. Next. So maybe in the interest of time, let me just focus on that the last point, because I think this is important. It's telling you the big bang for reforms is not going to come from tariffs, but it's going to come from addressing non-tariff measures and services. And these are the hard areas for reform. Next. So in conclusion, the setting is telling you there is a slow growth, a permanent structural change in the slow growth of the world trade. And we have to restructure. We have to find new sources of growth. Services, being part of the global value chain, and where is the resource of the push for trade going to come from? There's no more room for increased liberalization on the easy reforms. It's going to have to come from being part of the global value chain and addressing the hard parts of reforms. Next. We need to address it, I think, through a combination of domestic political commitment, pushed by external pressure, and external commitments. Whether or not we believe TPP will ever happen or not, or whether we believe all the components of TPP, I think has an important impact on the way we are going to do reforms in the foreseeable future, because it's kind of it's identifying areas where we haven't even thought about how to do reforms, like SOEs, for instance. But it's setting the standard. And even if you're not joining TPP, you do have to reform, because TPP members who are competing with you are reforming, right? So it will shape and it will have an impact on reforms. And what we need to do in ASEAN is to accelerate our own process, because otherwise we are going to be irrelevant. Forget about ASEAN centrality. It's going to be gone if we don't reform nationally, and if we don't move faster, deeper, in a strategic way to offset and balance what's happening in the rest of the world. So I'll stop there and hope that I didn't go over my allocated time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mari. Indeed, you didn't go over time, and I apologize for having to make you go through it so quickly. Can I ask the panel speakers to be sitting here and to take some questions and perhaps respond to them? And I'd like to ask Professor Wu to squeeze some 10-15 minutes out of the tea break and the next session. Can I invite Dr. Tan? Professor Sussangkarn, yeah, free sitting. Okay, we listened to a lot of issues and challenges facing. So we will speak from seats, and anyone has questions?
I have a lot of disagreement with you guys. I started with my work in 1970. I spent 45 years in industry and 15 years in China, 2 years in.
Excuse me, the mic is a bit off.
In terms of Malaysia and ASEAN, the biggest problem I believe is in ASEAN integration. We are fighting among ourselves. Whereas China has developed the supply chain so well that they can handle everything themselves. And today, China is talking about manufacturing 2025, and then you talk about we have Make in India coming very, very soon. Yeah, then we have Germany manufacturing 4.0, and everybody talking about in advance how they advance the manufacturing, and we still talk about our, within small little problem in Malaysia. So I think my concern is how can ASEAN as a pocket, yeah, unite together, integrate, instead of fighting among each other. Without uniting yourself, you can never fight India. India is on the come on the back, yeah. China and now the Europeans is going to change, yeah. European manufacturing from zero is going to change all the scenario. And China, one belt, one road will rewrite the entire supply chain. So here we are fighting for milk, and China is going ahead without you. So what can we do as Malaysians, as an Asian country?
Thank you, Dr. Lai. Is there any question related to this that we take on, or I'll just ask perhaps Dr. Mari to respond?
Let's take more questions.
You want to take a few questions together?
Questions. One round of questions and your part.
Actually, I'm surprised that nobody touched on the topic of big power rivalry and climate change. I guess this is a political hot potato, maybe. So that's why nobody is saying on that. Maybe I'd like to start the question by putting a comment from Dr. Tan. He said that the rise of China is basically attributed to the large pool of educated workforce. So therefore, my question in general would be that, does the socio-economic growth and development of a country, or in a broader range, the region, dependent on a high level of education of the general populace? And if so, why are not more countries putting more focus? I know Malaysia is putting a lot of focus. She just going to say that we have a very wonderful and beautiful blueprint. Then the question is that I think the professor from Thailand also mentioned or lamented on the lower level of education of the general workforce. Okay, and Dr. Mary has mentioned that now that the global change, the change in global value chain, and from the days of manufacturing of yesteryears to now, manufacturing has gone through a serious revolution, automation, and then nowadays, if you just dependent on manual labor, I think many manufacturing companies will not be able to survive. And then the question is that this is also dependent on the education of the general population. And countries like Germany and Korea, they have multiple paths for education, not just only in a university environment setting. They also have a lot of vocational and technical school that gear towards industry-ready graduates. And which goes to the question to Professor Jasmon, is that are we producing the right graduate? We are talking about graduate and unemployment. Are we producing the right graduate? And we always talk about English as a problem, but is English the scapegoat or masquerading a bigger problem of the level of programs that the country is implementing? Thank you.
Thank you. We have a cluster of questions related to supply chain and also the education system. Perhaps we take one more, and then you got enough questions. Okay, why?
Yeah, it's on manufacturing. I'm surprised that people only brushed on R&D, because I think moving forward it's very imperative, not just in education or technology, but also in manufacturing as well. I think a lot of corporations are picking up on having really substantial spending on R&D, and South Asia has picked up as well, with Tata Motor being at the APEC. So seeing to that, we are dealing with them on the zero tariff. It's very risky for ASEAN as a whole. So is it sustainable for us to move forward without R&D ever be in the top 5 talking points whenever we talk about economic or manufacturing?
Thank you. I guess the point of trade without R&D is not going to get us anywhere. Let us respond to this either as ASEAN individual country responses or collectively as ASEAN together. So I think the best person to start the response is Dr. Mari.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more with the sentiment about the need for ASEAN centrality and stronger ASEAN. especially with all that I tried to paint in terms of the setting that we are facing, the slowdown in trade growth, TPP coming on board and competing in terms of the fact that 4 members of ASEAN are TPP members, and all the mega regionals that are going on. So I totally agree. And I think the problem here is whenever we talk about ASEAN centrality, there always has to be a leadership role that has to come in to play. Having been involved in ASEAN for the last 30 years, including 10 years of it in the government, you need to have, Indonesia has to take a leadership role as the biggest country in ASEAN, and hopefully also supported by Thailand, by Malaysia and Philippines and some of the more bigger ASEAN countries. Because we are just focusing on goods, we are just focusing on tariffs. That's the deepest part of ASEAN. The rest is not very deep. And if we don't address it, we are going to be left behind, right? Because of TPP, because of what's happening in the rest of the world. We are not going to be part of the global value chain that is so changing so fast. So I totally agree, but I don't have a good answer as to how we can push more political commitment. I would hope that, whatever we think about TPP, the fact that TPP was finally completed last year should push ASEAN to move faster. That would be, the gut instinct that we should be reacting to. Hopefully, if enough of you in each of your countries shout this message and push our national political leaders to come to the ASEAN table and push this, it may happen. And maybe it should come from the private sector, because it is the private sector that would benefit. If there was a truly single ASEAN production base, because you address all the other barriers. And if I can just say very briefly on the manual labor and then the R&D, it's exactly the global value chain idea that you want to be able to specialize in one part of the value chain, including R&D. R&D including design. So I always use the example. We are making garments. We are used to thinking about exporting garments. We are sewing the garments. We supply the low cost labor to sew the garments. Don't think garments anymore. Think fashion. You want to design and have your own brand. That's your final target, right? And for that, you have to have R&D in various sectors. It doesn't have to be the high-end R&D. And final point, there was a report released recently by the World Bank on the digital economy. The digital economy, their conclusion was that the digital economy has not delivered the digital dividends that was thought for developing countries or for the lower levels of the labor force. And the reason is exactly the lack of training. So the ones who have the education and have the capital, they can get a lot of the benefits. And then the rest who can't access it or don't know how to use it get further left behind. And coming out of Jakarta, I know some of you were in Jakarta and got caught in the Uber and taxi violent demonstrations we had. That's kind of the manifestation that you see. So unless you can, and the answer is increase education training for those who are being left behind, to be able to not just access but use the technology so that they can develop.
Thank you. Let's move to Sussangkarn.
Thank you. I think ASEAN countries are by nature competitive with each other. If we play a football match against South Korea and we lose, no problem. If we play against Malaysia and we lose, that's a big problem. So for ASEAN to integrate, you need push factor from outside. And the push factor that has driven ASEAN to the AEC was basically the rise of China. Remember when the AEC was agreed among the ASEAN leaders, they set a target for 2020. I remember writing a paper at that time saying, you wait until 2020, there's nothing left to integrate. So it came to 2015, yet the implementation is still a lot of problem. So for the next phase of integration, we need a new push factor. I think TPP is probably not the right one. It may have to be the emergence of India. But that's, if we wait that long, then really ASEAN is not going to be that much. I just want to add a little bit about the education. Thailand has been doing education reform for the last 30 years, but it's never been successful. The critical issue in the case of Thailand, and also I heard maybe in the case of Malaysia, is the quality of the teachers. Because the way the education was organized, let's say 30, 40 years ago, the people that end up becoming teachers are people who could not get into universities. Okay, we have university entrance examination. If you fail, then what's the choice? And a lot of them would go to teachers' training college. So we end up now with 600, 700,000 teachers who need urgent upgrading. And it's so difficult because and you have these people who are basically not really in the top level of teaching, they're teaching our children. So any kind of reform is going to be very, very difficult.
Thank you, Professor Sussangkarn. May I pass the mic to Dr. Tan?
Let me just very quickly comment on the question of trade school. I mean, this is something that people from the industries have been talking to the government for ever since I left the central bank to join industry. So that was more than 30 years ago. But nothing has happened. Okay, I think you cannot move the level of manufacturing up. Okay, if you don't have people who are ready to handle sophisticated machineries. Okay, and if you don't train them from young, what do you do? So we are always in the position of taking high school graduate who has very little understanding of basic science to try to teach them very basic skills. Right? It's the same thing with college graduate. And whereas the college graduate that we hired 20 years ago, they can fit into the job within 6 months. The fresh graduate these days, 2 years. Okay? So that tells you how that quality has deteriorated. Okay? If you don't deal with that, as Professor rightly says, from primary school to secondary school and up, by the time they get to college, it's too late. Okay? The third point, and that's even more important, is attitude. Our younger generation comes with very different attitudes, very different value system. Okay? I think English is a very important medium of communication, but when you interact with people, you find that some of those actually don't have good command of English, but that has not prevented them from being able to communicate. Okay? To communicate well and to communicate in perfect language are two different issues. Okay? The last point I want to comment is on R&D. Here again you have a problem. Okay? Let's separate between really high level, very basic research and applied research. If you don't start to build a foundation by doing applied research, okay, how can you progress to the level of basic research? Right? In order to do basic research, you must have graduates who can think and ask questions beyond one step. What you find is that even engineers that you train and now can do maintenance for you, when a problem comes out, the thinking is just one step. The answer they give you is only one. Whereas, in the real world, you don't have a perfect answer. You have to choose which is, well, either the best or the worst or the worst or the best, I don't know, okay? If you don't do that, then what do you do, right? Now, Malaysia used to be the leader in producing rubber. Unfortunately, I think we are now number 4 or number 5. Okay? And when we were the world leader, we had set up very good research facilities, but they are separated into two parts. The planting side has always been Malaysia, but the downstream application part has always been London. I don't know why we never bring it back. Because by 20, 25 years ago, British manufacturing was hardly a power to be reckoned with anymore, right? My personal experience is I'm involved in the manufacture of glove for industrial application, right? We need to develop glove for very specific industries, but I cannot find people who knows how the latex interact with different type of liner. It can be cotton, it can be Calvia, or anything like that, right? Because those skills used to be in London, we never bring it back. I'm involved in the making the wire, sophisticated wire mesh to reinforce tires, right? Our customer used to be amongst the top 4 tire manufacturers in the world. People like that want you to be able to produce not just a wire for them, they want you to be able to tell them how your wire is going to bond with different type of rubber. Okay? And the different type of rubber is not just natural rubber, but a combination of synthetic and natural rubber. But again, that skill is supposed to be residing in London. Okay? So my conclusion to that is this. When you want to go on R&D, when you want to upgrade the skill of the country, you need a government who is determined to improve the quality and not just quantity. I think for social reasons, we need to improve the quantity in a hurry at some point in time. Okay? But once you have reached a certain level of quantity, if you don't start to pull back and start to emphasize quality, and you allow quality to continuously deteriorate, you are looking for trouble. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tan. I think the message is getting clearer and clearer before. Even though we have all the integration and all the trade and facilitation and things to attract greater investments into ASEAN, we don't develop our human resources well, we don't have the talent, we're not going to benefit from it. But let me invite Professor Jasmon to give us the last 2 minutes answer to this.
Oh, this is a heavy responsibility. Well, I just want to address the question that you put to me. Actually, the answer to this human resource problem is exactly like what was mentioned just now. Every year, I attend this forum between the Minister of Higher Education and the captains of industry, whereby they will be asked this question: why industry is not taking graduates and so on? And the same reason is given. The issues on soft skills, leadership skills, entrepreneurship skills, communication skills, and so on. Exactly those issues are raised again and again. Actually, there is no shortage of jobs. There are vacancies to be filled up, but somehow industry is not filling them up because they don't get the right candidates. So this is what the captain of industry is telling the Minister of Education, Minister of Higher Education, sorry. Secondly, going back to the school issue, yes, it is very true. The quality of the teachers. And I think the teachers' union are very powerful in this country. You really need to have a very strong minister to actually negotiate and talk to the unions in order to improve the quality of the teachers. Even though if you see in the Nation Education Blueprint, it is all mentioned there on what could be done to improve the quality, but it is a matter like what was mentioned in Thailand, where they have actually not been able to do the reforms. It's exactly in this country, we need, like what our professor said there, that we need a strong leader who will really be able to push for the upgrading of the quality of the teachers and so on. We used to say we want to take the best graduates to become teachers. Is it happening? It is really not happening yet. They used to talk about giving higher salaries to this new cream of graduates who wants to become teachers. Again, is this happening or not? So, again, at the end of the day, we know the answer to all this. We need better quality teachers in order to produce quality students. So that is the final message to all this. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jasmon.
I think many of you probably don't realize. I didn't realize until I got involved in school board. We pay our principal 500 ringgit
extra to be principal. So a senior teacher can actually make more than a headmaster or headmistress. So who in the right mind will want to be principal? Okay, and if you don't have good principal, how do we have good school?
Thank you very much. I thank you for your patience. Let's give our panelists a great